Shabbat Shalom. I was not here last week, obviously, and which also means there was no live stream, so you guys will have to fill me in a little bit. Talk to Noah. Well, that's good. That was the portion. Yeah. So good job staying on topic, which doesn't always happen. So, any highlights or anything, any good moments that are sticking out in your mind from last week? I'm just curious because I was
on the first 30 minutes. You guys did discuss Nephilim.
Oh.
Briefly.
And you figured it all out and have it perfectly, you've made all the appropriate conclusions, right?
Pretty much.
It was one of those mysterious topics that we continue to wrestle with. Did you get to Tower of Babel, or did you stick on sand? Yeah, I figured. It's hard to get through everything in these portions. We were just talking about, I was asking if anybody had any kind of moments or anything that stuck out from last week since I wasn't here.
Oh, yeah.
So if you have anything, you're welcome to, that comes to mind, you're welcome to, not to put you on the spot right as you watch it.
Yeah.
That's what we're doing.
Think.
Come on, pop quiz.
Think.
Well, I was going through my stuff this week.
Yeah. So, there's a lot of different things to talk about with Noah, so I was
Yeah, I know.
curious what came up, but we don't have to.
Connected the curse of the land, basically the blessings. We're connecting Genesis, the story of creation, to where the land had come, and then the renewing of the land.
Mhm.
Was. We did talk a little bit about that.
Good, yeah. So, yeah, I'll let if anybody else has anything else to add, because that will feed into right kind of where we're going to go today. But do you have anything else?
Well, no, we just talked about a lot.
Talked about a lot,
Like,
yeah.
What do you pick?
Right. There's so much in these early portions are so difficult because there's so much.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, all the portions are kind of that way, but especially these first few in Genesis.
I will say that, once we kind of went through, Johannes mentioned 2 Peter 2 and Jude, how they relate to, I just had never really, you read them now and you go, oh, yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
Makes more sense.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing we did get a little bit into was
Where you at?
why Canaan was cursed
Yes.
for Ham's discretion.
Yeah.
Theories.
Mhm.
A lot of different theories.
Yeah. Which is really all we've got.
Yeah.
I know, because we never really came to.
I know, it's hard to kind of come to a really
Uh-huh.
decisive conclusion,
Yeah.
but
We were just given levels of theories that
Yeah.
different rabbis taught.
gotcha. Cool. Well, good. Well, I'm glad you kind of talked about this aspect that this Noah story is kind of brings in this piece about renewing the land and stuff like that, because it is kind of we'll kind of talk about. So this week we have the Abrahamic Covenant, which I'm very excited about. In my class that I just took on the Tanakh, there were some things about the Abrahamic Covenant that kind of clicked for me in a different way that I was excited about. So I'm going to share them with you. And I have a handout for you in a little bit. So some people like handouts. I get excited about handouts. So we'll get there. That will hopefully help us make some connections, because basically what I've come the conclusion, I'm kind of telling you the end before the beginning, I guess, but is how foundational the Abrahamic Covenant is. And I think we kind of know that, but I think we tend to get a little bit more stuck and caught up in the Mosaic Covenant, and especially these, what do we do with it now, and all these kinds of things that I think actually, not that that's not important, obviously I'm not saying the Mosaic Covenant is not important, but I think if we look back and see the foundation of the Abrahamic Covenant, I think it actually can help us
Yeah.
with a lot of other areas and some other things that we kind of get tripped up on sometimes. So, like I said, this is the third portion, or maybe I didn't say that, I don't know. This is the third portion of the Torah, third covenant. We're moving right along. We're going to take a break. We're not going to get into new covenants for a while after this one, but these first three portions, it always hits me that we have a covenant in each portion. So, first covenant of the Torah is what? Adamic covenant, yes. So what are some of the, what is that covenant about?
Seed and land.
Seed and land,
Yeah.
So, yeah, and it's this, so of course the creation story, and this is a broader context than just the covenant, is kind of chaos. You know, there's chaos, the earth is formless and void, and God creates order, and then sin comes and we go back to chaos again, right?
Yeah.
But we have this, you know, also with kind of on the tail end of that story, we have Genesis 3:15, we have this messianic promise of the seed that's going to come and crush the head of the serpent. So we have kind of that glimpse of messianism there. What's the sign of the Adamic covenant? Clothing, very good. Because that's the first account that we have that blood would have been shed, correct? Because God had to kill an animal to make clothing for Adam and Eve. So the fact that we're wearing clothes is we're wearing a sign of this covenant and a sign of this fall event that happened way back when. Okay, so then second covenant is of course the Noahide covenant. And like Lori mentioned, this is actually kind of a renewing of the Adamic covenant. There's actually some people like to debate over whether the Adamic covenant is really a covenant. I think it is, but it doesn't say covenant, and there's a couple things that scholars like to nitpick about, but that's fine. But the covenant with Noah is indisputable because we have covenantal language, but it is very much a renewal covenant. Actually, in the Hebrew, the covenant, the word that's used for making the covenant with Noah is a word that implies renewing and not kind of cutting a brand new covenant. There's just two different words in Hebrew for that. And so some of the things with the Noachic covenant is that God says he will not curse the earth. We have the repetition of the be fruitful and multiply command that Adam was also given to Adam and Eve. They have dominion. They still have this dominion over the animal kingdom that was this rulership that Adam and Eve had, of course, over the animals. We have this command not to eat blood. And what's the sign of the covenant with Noah?
Rainbow.
The rainbow, of course. Very good. So all covenants have a sign, right? Okay, so.
And all those signs have been they try to pervert.
Yes. Yes, that does seem to be the pattern.
Yeah.
Okay, and so now we arrive at Genesis 12, and one of the things I am very thankful for, sometimes, because we've talked about how, like, it's so interesting, like, at the end of Deuteronomy, we have, like, the portion is, like, one chapter, maybe two, and then you flip back to Genesis, and you have, like, 6 chapters, and you're like, hello, got us a break here. But what the nice thing about this portion is that we get all the pieces of the Abrahamic covenant in one portion, which is helpful for purposes of our discussion today, because we're going to focus on Genesis 12, 15, and 17, which are all within this portion. And there's a lot of other cool things. We'll briefly talk about Melchizedek, because I don't think Lori will let me skip past it probably. But we're going to focus on Abraham because I want to really emphasize some things that are going on with Abraham and how the covenant is made with him. Okay, so before we really dig into the text, just from your reading or what you know, what are the three aspects of the Abrahamic covenant? What are the three things promised? What does God promise to Abraham? Seed. Land. Mm-hmm. And?
Blood.
Not blood. This one is a little bit like lots of children. That's the seed.
He's gonna bless all the nations.
Blessing, yes. So we have land, seed, and blessing. So remember those three. Don't worry, I'll repeat them a lot. I'll probably be the broken record about land, seed, and blessing today. But that's okay. So at this point, I think it would be helpful if I gave you this handout that I've been talking about.
Good.
So pass around that side and pass around this side. This is from my professor. My professor used this when he was teaching about this covenant, and I just found it incredibly helpful. So I'm just
Hey.
for you. Hi, Johannes. So, okay. So we're gonna we'll work our way kind of from top to bottom through this handout. Because we're going to kind of see a little bit, because kind of like, this is another one of those, there's lots of patterns in the Bible, of course. We're going to kind of see where Abraham is coming from, what God says to him, and what kind of the future, looking toward the future. So hopefully that will continue to make more sense as we work our way through this. Okay, so starting with, so kind of keep this as a reference, but we're going to start working through Genesis 12, 15, and 17. We can do it. We're going to make it. Okay. So Genesis 12:1 starts out with, Then Adonai said to Abram, Get going out from your land and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land I will show you. My heart's desire is to make you into a great nation, to bless you, to make your name great so that you may be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, but whoever curses you, I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. So, so we talked about, we already know the Abrahamic Covenant has land, seed, and blessing. And so, right here in Genesis 12:1, God is really calling Abraham out of his kind of natural born reality of all of those things. He says he's calling him out from your land or from your country, it says your country on the on your handout, but TLB says land. I think we can understand that. From your relatives, so seed, and from your father's house. And this is kind of connecting with the blessing, and of course he goes on to talk about blessing. But blessing is often transferred through the father, and because we can even think of other stories throughout the Torah where the father is bestowing a blessing and an inheritance on the children. So I think that's kind of the implication there. So that's just kind of to say God is kind of calling him out of where he came from, and he's saying, I'm going to do all of these things for you in my name, and in kind of recreate them in some sense. So, and also, of course, so it says it's going to make him into a great nation. Of course, we'll read later that he'll be the father of many nations. So the thing about, with the Abrahamic Covenant also is we have this reality that it can impact all people. Because at this point, we don't really have Israel, we don't have the Jewish people. This is kind of square one. So we're kind of going from we're pulling out one person, and we've talked about this before, is that eventually this grows into a nation, which is where we get by the time of the Exodus. But at this point, it's one man calling him out from his family, from his land that he was born into, and God is saying, I'm going to do this new thing through you. So the great thing about Abraham is he starts off well. He's obedient. God says, okay, time to get up and go to this land that I'm going to show you. And he gets up and goes. The title, the name of this portion is Lech Lecha, which means basically get up and go. It's that beginning portion there. And so in verse 7, verses 4 through 6 is kind of like is his kind of traveling. So by verse 7, he's in the land. Great. We're making good progress. So it seems. So, and so again, this is kind of the God kind of re-emphasizes his point a lot throughout this narrative. Because in verse 7, Adonai appears to Abram and says, I will give this land to your seed. And so Abraham builds an altar, and calls on the name of Adonai. So, it seems like, to me sometimes it seems like, great, just stay. You're in the land. Just stay there, because then we wouldn't have all of these thousands of years of discussion of the land belongs to Israel, but they're not always there. Why is that happening? And all of these things. Because then, in my Bible, let's turn the page, verse 10, but there is a famine. So he goes down to Egypt. So he gets the land, God promises the land, and then he leaves. Which, of course, this is pointing to, we have this happen multiple times, right? We have lots of, and then they leave and go to Egypt. This is so for some reason, God needs the travel narrative. God needs his people to have this experience of coming back up to the land. I don't have all the conclusions about why that's so necessary, but it seems that is important. It seems that is how God works, is that this journey up to the land that he has promised them is important. Okay, so the rest of chapter 12 and through 13, we kind of have this reality that Abraham is in Egypt for a while. We have this whole story about Lot, and then, but my point about the land is that when he leaves is that we already kind of see a little bit of this kind of delay. So this is one of the questions that people often ask when studying covenant and when studying the Torah is how do we understand when these covenants are fulfilled? Are you to expect an immediate fulfillment or not? And I think we know the whole story, so we know that this takes thousands of years, and in some sense we are still in process of working out the fulfillment of all of this. But that is a question that's often asked, is can we see fulfillment of it immediately? And that's not necessarily what we need here. So let's keep going.
Well, isn't it like God fulfills his part,
Yes.
but then we have to cooperate with them?
Yes, we do.
Because
And
for mankind, it takes so long.
right. Yes.
I mean, I don't know.
So, and this is one of the things we're going to get to with who's responsible for what with the Abrahamic Covenant, which we'll get to when we get into 15, where the covenant is really actually cut and solidified. But yes, I mean, there is responsibility of, especially once you get into, especially with the Mosaic, and that's why the Mosaic Covenant is so difficult to wrestle with, because there is a lot of responsibility on people and obedience. So the Mosaic Covenant is really is a little bit of a different kind of covenant, but we'll talk a little bit more about that when we kind of get into some of this. But
Thomas McComiskey, Dan's professor, I have a book by him, and I was reading in there, and he says that the Abrahamic Covenant is a permanent covenant, as is the New Covenant, but the Mosaic Covenant has conditions. So
Right.
you have, if you do this, then this.
Right.
So even in terms of like the land covenant, the Mosaic Covenant has conditions on it, although it doesn't nullify the Abrahamic Covenant, because
Right.
the Abrahamic Covenant was a permanent covenant given to Abraham and his seeds to conquer the land or have the land as a gift.
yeah,
And it's also interesting in terms of like the responsibility. Abraham's father actually began the journey to Canaan just a few verses before Lech Lecha, but he stopped, right? He stopped at Haran. And so there was something even in God calling Abraham, okay, it's like Terah never really finished. We don't know what the conversation was between Abraham's dad and the Lord, but he stopped. He never really finished. So the Lord went to the next generation to, call Abraham out so that that promise and the covenant would also continue.
Yeah, which I do think points to, and there's a lot of, because obviously we just don't have all the details in the text, like Johannes is saying, we don't have, all the conversations recorded for us, but that's one of the debates too, is this calling of Abraham, is it really, was he called because he was obedient, or was there something special about him? Because there's really nothing particularly astounding about Abraham. He's a person. He's just kind of a person, and seems like we have this kind of shadow of a lineage, and he falls within that. But like Johannes is saying, maybe this opportunity was kind of offered to his father, and this is
Right.
I'm not definitively saying this, so don't say I'm saying this is what happened. I'm just saying that this is an idea that's kind of rolled around sometimes, but and maybe his father was like, didn't make it all the way, or it was just this progressive story and it was always meant to be Abraham. We don't really know that, but it does seem, because like I was saying, it's just like, we have this, that we see all the time, especially with Moses. In verse 4, we see, Abraham went just as Adonai had spoken. So I think his obedience, is significant. He is wanting to follow the Lord, even though at this point we don't really know how much understanding they have of what that really means, because at this point, it's just not all the theology and everything about God is not as well developed as it might be today.
Well, and also, like, with some of the commentaries I was reading of, like, even when the famine hit, was Abram's sin to leave the land and go down to Egypt, shouldn't he have stayed there and trusted the Lord? And it's kind of like the same thing we see with the Israelites during Moses' time is we're developing a relationship here. So was there fear factors? They're going to find my wife attractive, and I'm going to get. I mean, there's these. To just say, okay, God called you, so therefore you should trust Him.
Right.
Who, besides Yeshua, have we ever seen walk out the fullness of God said it, I trust it, and therefore there's no fear or trying to figure things out on my own.
Right. I think that's very true, and I think Abraham. This is one of the things. There's an extra copy up here, Matt. I think that this is also one of the things I love about Abraham is I actually do feel like we start to see a more relational interaction with God. We really and because even this is not in this week's portion. But next week, even, this whole interaction when he intercedes over Sodom, is very much like he's really trying to wrestle through this with God. And the one perspective I've read about that story that I love is God's really teaching him the heart of a father, of wanting, this heart turned towards the children. He doesn't even really know those people, but he doesn't want them to be destroyed. And he's if there's, this negotiation down through the number of righteousness, but like I said, I know, but it's this perspective of father. So I think there is this very relational, and we're going to continue to see that even through as God is in the process of cutting this covenant. We're seeing, we're going to see some more of this relationship building with him. So before we move on to 15, let's talk about Melchizedek for just a second. This is another one of these great mysteries that we would all really like to understand a little bit more, because it seems a bit out of left field that these few verses are kind of dropped in here. There's some reference to Melchizedek later on, but we still don't really know a lot about him. So we can talk about some of the things we do know about him, and that's kind of just what we'll have to be satisfied with. So Melchizedek is the king of Salem. Where's Salem? Jerusalem. Interesting. So this is technically kind of our first reference to Jerusalem. So we know that Jerusalem exists in some sense, all the way back to this point. Of course, we understand traditionally that the Garden of Eden was in Jerusalem, but at this point we're far enough past that there was no evidence of that anymore. So he's from Jerusalem. He brings out bread and wine. Interesting. And it already said he was a king, and now he's being called, I'm in verse 18 of chapter 14, by the way. He's a priest of El Elyon. So he's a king and a priest. Interesting. And he offers a blessing from God. He's blessing in the name of God, of El Elyon, God Most High. And Abraham gives him 1/10 of everything. Interesting. So what does all that mean? I mean, so one thing that we can conclude from this is that there are other people in other places following God, right? The name of God, because we had back in, after Cain and Abel's story, it talks about, and then people started calling on the name of God. So at this point, because we have this other person coming who's not already with Abraham, of course he's in Jerusalem, he was in the land, but we have So there's other people who are following God. To what extent, we don't know. Again, this is Genesis. There's a lot we don't know. And he's a king and a priest, which is why it's so significant later on when it talks about, the Messiah coming in the order of Melchizedek, because it's a king and priest. Because as you look through the rest of the story, you don't have a lot of people. There's some people who are, on some level, it will be kind of called that. David is kind of referred to a little bit as king and priest. But to fully fulfill both of those roles isn't really seen until Yeshua. And really, the three main roles that we look at, as far as that we need, are king, priest, and prophet. And so we're always kind of, the prophet part kind of comes in later. But ultimately, eventually, the messianic expectation starts to become, we're looking for king, priest, and prophet. And of course, we don't have anyone who fully embodies all of those roles until Yeshua. So that was a little bit of a side note. So anything, Melchizedek. Anything else? Anybody wants to comment? Johannes, you got something?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we go to Hebrews 7, right, the context there, my personal view is actually Melchizedek was an actual person, a king,
Yeah.
and a priest. But the writer of Hebrews likens Melchizedek to Yeshua, the Kohen Gadol, right?
Right.
So there's something that Melchizedek was functioning in a sense where even Abraham, who is the father of the Levites, who are the priesthood of Israel, as the father of the nation, as also a priestly role that Abraham had, he actually tithed to a figure who is higher than him that actually pronounced blessing over him. So I think there's a connection that could be made, that there's one that is greater than even Abraham, that Abraham tithes to, and this person, this priest, higher priest of a different order than other than the Levitical priesthood, that eventually comes out of the line of Abraham, is pronouncing. So the writer of Hebrews connects Yeshua's priesthood,
Yes.
To the priesthood of Melchizedek. So I think that connection is an important one, and I think it's interesting that Abraham tithes to him, and Melchizedek actually pronounces a blessing on him. So
yeah, and the bread and wine is this this table
Fellowship,
type of reality. There's a lot of, it's very covenantal, yes, and it's and I would agree that I think Melchizedek was a king, a person.
Yeah.
Some like to kind of say he's he's kind of the angel, similar to the angel of the Lord, that he's kind of this presence, but I don't think that makes a lot of sense with how the wording is here.
And Abraham had interacted with Adonai before,
Right.
so why the different appearance?
Right, and it does seem that when this angel of the Lord, Yeshua figure shows up, that he's recognizable. So it does seem to make sense that he would have recognized him if that's who this was. And since it's there's also there's other kings, there's other people kind of present, it sounds like, and so they would have recognized that this is another king. Also, it's not this mysterious heavenly being. So I think it does make sense that this is a person. It's just kind of an interesting, and the Hebrews connection is definitely important. I think it's just this really interesting story that we have this, this king and priest with this table fellowship pronouncing a blessing, and like Johannes is saying, is showing that Abraham is recognizing that he is coming in the name of the same God, presumably, and receiving this blessing and understanding that his role is kind of greater than his at this point. That Melchizedek's role is kind of greater than Abraham's at this point. So even though it's such a short little account, but it does seem to be laying the foundation for something much greater in the future. Okay. So now we get to Genesis 15, which is where we really have the covenant being cut with Abraham. So this is where, let me read a few verses and then we'll kind of take this section by section, I think. Let's see. So 15:1. After these things, the word of Adonai came to Abram in a vision, saying, "Do not fear, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward." But Abram said, "My Lord Adonai, what will you give me, since I am living without children, and the heir of my household is Eliezer of Damascus?" Then Abram said, "Look, you have given me no seed, so a houseborn servant is my heir." Then behold, the word of Adonai came to him, saying, "This one will not be your heir, but in fact one who will come from your own body will be your heir. He took him outside and said, "Look up now at the sky and count the stars, if you are able to count them." And then he said to him, "So shall your seed be." Then he believed in Adonai, and he reckoned it to him as righteousness. Okay, so this is where we start to see, like this relationship building that, Abram is recognizing, okay, you said there's going to be this seed, but I don't have any children. Not only do I not have any children, I'm old, and so is my wife. He's like, so, in the ancient culture, so then his household servant is going to become the heir, and God's like, no, your heir is going to be your child, basically. And so, but it seems as though, but we don't have God responding with this, "Oh, ye of little faith." We have him saying, "No, look, I am gonna do this. I understand your concern about the situation, but I'm still gonna do this, and I'm gonna, you're gonna have descendants as many as the stars and all that thing." And it says that Abraham believed him, and that's where we get this famous kind of phrase that we have with Abraham of "it's reckoned to him as righteousness," that we see quoted even in the Hall of Faith passage in Hebrews.
It's a flat declaration by the Lord that no, your servant will not inherit.
Right.
You will have children.
Right.
And he believed it.
Mm-hmm.
He
Exactly.
accepted the word of the Lord.
Yeah.
Which I find interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which I think even just goes back to, I think we can assume that Abraham knows something of what happened with Noah and something of what happened, what has happened so far, and who knows what else based on what's not recorded, because we've had quite a long history of time pass by this point, and obviously we just have.
Who knows what world
we kind of have.
Could have
Yeah, we kind of have the Cliff Notes version at this point. So it seems that he knows something about the character of God, that if God says something, that he will do it. So his God's reputation is is working for, he has a good reputation so far, is my point.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're dealing with this, again, there are 3 parts of the covenant, so that's dealing kind of with the seed portion. Abraham's like, all right, this is what you said, but this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Okay, so then let's continue on. So verse 7. And then he said to him, "I am Adonai, who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans in order to give you this land to inherit it." And so he said, "My Lord Adonai, how will I know that I will inherit it?" And so then we're going to get into the covenant. So again, we have this kind of relational, okay, God, you said this is going to be my land. How's that going to happen? Because this is I know this sounds really simple, but I think we are so used to saying the land belongs to Israel and the Jewish people, and back to Abraham. The land was never empty. There were always all these other people living there. And so it's not like, God kind of put a fence around it and it's like, all right, I'm gonna save this for you. There's other people living there. There's other nations have history in the land, and so it's a big deal to say, all right, this is going to be yours, especially when that's not his native land. That's not where he's from. So he doesn't really have, in the natural, he doesn't really have a claim to it yet. So, but again, it's this relational, okay, God, this is what you said, how is this going to work? And so then we get into this actual kind of covenantal reality. So let me read the rest of 17 and then we'll talk about that. Okay, so verse 9. Then he said to him, "Bring me a 3-year-old young cow, a 3-year-old she-goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young bird. So he brought all these to him and cut them in half, and put each piece opposite the other, but he did not cut the birds. Then birds of prey came down upon the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. When the sun was about to set and a deep sleep fell on Abram, behold, terror of great darkness was falling upon him. Then he said to Abram, know for certain that your seed will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. But I am going to judge the nation that they will serve. Afterward they will go out with many possessions, but you will come to your fathers in peace. You will be buried at a good old age. Then in the 4th generation they will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. When the sun set and it became dark, behold, there was a smoking oven and a fiery torch that passed between these pieces. On that day Adonai cut a covenant with Abram, saying, I give this land to your seed from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates River. The Kenite, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Raphaites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, and the Girgashites, and the Jebusites.
Good job.
All the ites.
Yeah.
Okay.
People that were already in the land.
People that
Yeah.
were already in the land. Of course, some of those names, some of those come up later and they deal with them. And I just want to point something out, and I did look up the reference somewhere in Deuteronomy. I feel like it's fairly early on. But anyway, it talks about they go in, and even when they go in, it talks about that they're gonna reap the harvest of what's already there. So in some sense, there is a blessing in that this land is being cultivated, because there are people who are caring for it. And so when they do eventually come in and conquer the land, they are basically provided for. So God kind of works that out for them. And it talks about them taking the land little by little. It talks about, they kind of push these people out in sections. And through that, God ends up providing for them. And of course, they do kind of plunder their gold and silver and those kinds of things as well. So in some sense, it becomes, it's beneficial to them, but it is also quite difficult. So it's kind of this mixture. It's, and it requires a lot of obedience for them to actually go in and take the land and take over all those people. But
It requires a fight.
it requires a
for
fight.
it. And so
Yeah.
God was saying, here you go.
Exactly.
But yet he did in a way,
Right.
because he gave him a good land.
Yes.
Nourished
Right.
and ready.
Right.
Mhm.
Right.
What
Exactly.
are
It's-
those Ham's descendants?
Ham's descendants. I think so. Yeah.
That territory?
Yeah.
That territory.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It required a struggle to overcome,
Mm-hmm.
but
Yeah.
I think, like I said last week, overcoming doesn't happen without an obstacle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really good. That's good. And it's that continued obedience, and that's that continued
Exactly.
relationship building of because it goes back to that, even that parent-child relationship, as you're, by the time they're taking the land, they're kind of expected to have grown up a little bit, to have a little bit more faith, and that God can expect a little bit more of them. It's, kind of the difference from a very young child. Yeah, you might you're going to tie their shoes for them, but once they get to a certain age, it's like, no, you have to tie your own shoes. That's a really simple example, but
Yeah.
the point is there's
Yeah.
progressive expectation of responsibility as they kind of have built relationship with the Lord. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the actual, how this covenant actually is cut here. Okay, so we have this lovely image of animals cut in half and laid out. That's really lovely. Again, this is kind of like our modern mindset is like, that's really disgusting. I don't really want to be around for that. But this is of course the ancient tradition. This is how covenants worked. So normally, when you're making a covenant, you have kind of basically you have one party that needs something from another party is usually what's happening. And so when they're making this, they have, okay, this group of people needs protection from this one. And so this one says, I will protect you as long as you do this. And these people say, okay, we'll do that if you'll protect us. So there's there's requirements on both sides. So what they would do is they'd cut these animals, and they're walking between the pieces of the animals, and they're basically saying, if either one of us does not uphold our end of the bargain, we're going to become like these animals, meaning dead. So
take it very seriously.
right. So there, your life is at stake on this covenant. So that's the ancient tradition that's going on here. However, the interesting thing that happens in this situation, and this is why this covenant is so different and why we can consider it a permanent, unconditional, everlasting covenant, is because does Abraham, or Abram at this point, his name hasn't, sorry, I'm using them interchangeably.
It's fine.
You know what I mean. His name hasn't been changed yet, but same person. Does he walk through?
No.
He doesn't. He's asleep, actually. Which part of me is like, that's kind of like one of those things I like to ponder. Why did he have to be asleep? Like, was he not, like, would he have tried to walk through if he'd been awake? Like, why did he have to be asleep? It just seems, it's really interesting to me. I don't
Well,
know.
if that was a tradition, maybe he would have.
Yeah, maybe. So maybe this is God's way of like, I'm gonna make sure that you can't do this, even though his intention probably would have been good, because he's like, well, I have to hold up my end of it. Yeah.
And then he died.
But
I think the answer to that is in verse 17 though, because God is the one who walks through,
right, God
not
of course
man.
does. Right.
And that's I think the key.
Well,
answer
of
to
course.
that.
Yes, that definitely is the point. God is definitely making the point that he's going to walk through and not Abraham. It just is. I just get caught up on that and kind of like to ponder why he
Yeah.
had to be asleep
Yeah.
for that. Why God couldn't just say, "You stand over there, I'm going to walk through." I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it says that he was terrified
Yes.
and dark.
Yes.
So, but he was asleep and terrified?
I think,
That's not making sense to
well,
me
the
yet.
fear, I think, has to do with the vision that he was seeing.
Mhm.
So the Lord gives him a vision of what's going to happen to the people 400 years later. They're going to be in Egypt. So there's something that the Lord is communicating to him through a trance or like this
Mhm.
deep
Yeah.
sleep. Yeah. So
Mhm. Yeah, because it seems like, yes, he's asleep, but he's very aware of what's happening. Or he's being given a dream or vision of some kind.
Yeah.
So he's not unaware, he's not really absent from the process. He's just in this kind of different state, which is
yeah.
it is a very interesting reality. So yes, so God, kind of lets him know, which I always think of like, man, Lord, it's kind of, in some ways it's difficult, because I can imagine being Abraham and being kind of grieved over like all of this hardship that's about to come for his descendants at the same time, because he probably is feeling this, he's probably been feeling some level of joy, like he is going to have a child, which he didn't think was ever going to happen. But then ultimately there's going to be all this suffering and all this difficulty. But obviously we know that there's, that ultimately God is going to bring them back. So that's a really difficult position to be in, but yes, the point is, in verse 17, that this smoking oven and fiery torch had passed between the pieces. So that is, this is one of the times where kind of God is spoken of as kind of with this kind of fire, this fiery reality.
And later on in the Torah,
Mhm.
Moses receives the very same imagery in the first temple
Mhm.
of God being a pillar of
Yes,
fire
right.
by night and a pillar of smoke by day.
Right,
It's
right.
the same
Mhm.
imagery.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Do you have any opinion about, like, looking at the Hebrew words? I've been told that possibly one of these represents Jesus and one represents the Father.
I don't know. I haven't looked. I don't know the Hebrew off the top of my head. Do you know anything about that, Johannes?
No, I haven't actually looked at that, but what I've read so far is more like the presence of God that is seen continually, because he was in the midst of the fire, like,
Mhm.
fire by, like he was saying, fire by night, cloud by day. So it's that same imagery. But you'll notice, like later on, like even that Yeshua is in the fire, and the Spirit is also connected. Like my Spirit never departed them. My Spirit actually helped them keep the Torah. Like later on in the prophets, you see that. So we can, from that, we can say like the Godhead. You know, they're inseparable. They're in unity and inseparable. So God's presence was there in some sense. So I don't know. I haven't dug into the Hebrew though.
I had them written down, but I don't have that notebook with me.
Yeah, that'll be interesting.
Yeah. Okay. So kind of looking at this process of cutting the covenant, I think hopefully that understanding that makes it clear to us that no person is capable of nullifying this covenant, because only God passed between the animals. He's basically saying this covenant will not ever be broken in. It goes on forever, which I think we're going to continue to talk about, because you'll see on your handout that I have it linked to some other covenants that, but I think that this is really significant, even especially for us as members of Messianic congregation, Messianic believers, that we understand, the calling of Israel, because of course this does have implication for all nations, and we'll even talk about this a little bit more going forward, but ultimately for the Jewish people, because we're about to talk, we're going to get into, when we get to 17, we talk about circumcision and things like that, but just the fact that God doesn't break the covenant with his people. And remember, this is a threefold covenant, so land, seed, and blessing. So the land, that promise doesn't ever go away. The promise of a seed through Abraham doesn't go away. The promise of this blessing from the Father doesn't go away. And I think that, that's why I think that in viewing this covenant as foundational is so important, because it shows, as we see kind of the threads go through the rest of Scripture and on these other covenants kind of build on it and things like that, I think that knowing the faithfulness of God is really helpful to us, because the popular, there's a lot of popular theology out there that's, saying that with the new covenant and with Yeshua coming, the old has kind of gone away, but I don't really want this to go away. I would much rather be serving a God that I can see the faithfulness back even to Abraham and even before. So I know that that's not a new concept for us, but I think that's why I think this is so important, is that he is faithful.
The scripture with the fire and the smoke, if you look at Exodus 19, starting at verse 18, this is also when he's coming to Mount Sinai. Now the entire Mount Sinai was in smoke, because Adonai had descended upon it in fire.
Right.
The smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace. So here we're seeing that fire, we're seeing the furnace, we're seeing the smoke. So it's like the Lord appeared the same way to do the covenant.
Exactly.
Yep.
Yeah.
And it was the same terror that hit Abraham, that hit the people that were at the mountain when the fire was visible. It's like,
And Emma, you were saying that this is the permanent, covenant, and like, and the, when Paul says in Romans 4, like for the promise to Abraham or to his seed, seed right there is singular, even in the Greek there, to become heir of the world. So he's not talking about specific land there, but he's talking about the seed of Abraham who actually becomes the heir of the whole world. It's connected to the Abrahamic Covenant here. And I think we talked about this last week too, is that, Genesis 3 is super important, right? Like there is this seed that's going to crush the head of the serpent. So the seed is now kind of going through, and God is using covenants to bring about his plan of redemption.
Right.
And so the Abrahamic Covenant is actually even the basis for the new covenant, in which the seed that comes through the line of Abraham
Right.
even becomes the heir of not only the Davidic covenant, but also the heir of the world.
Right.
So.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and I think we even start to see. So the way I kind of see it is kind of some of these covenants start to like even clarify what, especially with the seed, like what that means, because like Johannes is saying, we had back in Genesis 3 the promise of the seed. Okay, well then how do we know who is that seed? You know. And so then here we have this promise with Abraham. No, I'm going to bring someone from you, not your servant, but I'm going to some from your line. And then as we're going to see, we get further clarification. We're going to continue to narrow down where this, where the line of this seed going forward. So it's almost like God is providing clarification through covenant.
Yeah. I think Genesis 22, the binding of Isaac, is super important to understand.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. Okay, so continuing on here, when we look at, so of course, so we've now had this covenant come. Abraham is on board. He understands the seed is going to come from him. He apparently isn't quite, well, and Sarah's part of this as well. And so we have this Hagar and Ishmael reality. And we're not gonna dive too deeply into that because I want us to keep going with some of this covenantal language. But there is a promise, even to Ishmael becoming a great nation and to having a land, and so we even see
and to
Hagar, and so I think we kind of sometimes I've looked at that and I've been like, this just makes it really complicated. This makes things really complicated. Because even as we're about to see, I mean, Ishmael is circumcised. He's a part of the family. He's part of this covenant reality. And so we can't just disregard him. And we can't just make, the descendants of Ishmael entirely the opponent. I mean, even though there's obviously some clashing and there's a lot of things in history, but at the starting point, he is part of this covenantal reality, and so we have to keep that in mind as we go forward. Okay, so then we get to Genesis 17, when Abram is 99 years old, and this is where we have this kind of restating of the covenant again, and also including this kind of requirement of circumcision, which of course becomes the sign of the Abrahamic covenant. So let's just start at beginning 17 a little bit. We probably won't read the whole thing, but so when Abram was 99 years old, Adonai appeared to Abram, and he said to him, I am El Shaddai, continually walk before me, and you will be blameless. My heart's desire is to make my covenant between me and you, and then I will multiply you exceedingly much. Abram fell on his face, and God spoke with him, saying, For my part, because my covenant is with you, you will be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer will your name be Abram, but your name will be Abraham, because I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. Yes, I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into a nation, and kings will come forth from you. Yes, I will establish my covenant between me and you and your seed and throughout the generations for an everlasting covenant, in order to be your God and your seed's God after you. I will give to you and to your seed to your seed after you the land where you are an outsider, the whole land of Canaan, as an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. God also said to Abraham, As for you, my covenant you must keep, you and your seed, and after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant that you must keep between me and you and all your seed after you. All your males must be circumcised. You must be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin, and this will become a sign of my covenant between me and you. He says it must be all your at 8 days old, and so on. So, and then they of course go on, and there's continually this conversation back and forth. But like, really, is Sarah really gonna have a baby? Like, really? And he even laughs in verse 17. It says he laughed because he's like, I'm 100 years old. Sarah is 90. Are you kidding me? And God's like, no, for real. Anyway, I'm paraphrasing, but you get the point. It's like, but there's still this conversation. There's still this relationship of it within it. Is like really, and of course then we have this record that Abraham again was obedient, and he took Ishmael, and he took in verse 23. That's why this significant. Ishmael is part of this covenant. Abraham took Ishmael and all the houseborn slaves and purchased slaves and everyone among them, and he circumcised them. So it said, and it says that Abraham was 99 and Ishmael was 13. And so, but the commandment is about 8 days old, and so kind of looking ahead, Isaac kind of becomes the first one who's circumcised at the quote unquote correct time. And so that is even another sign that he's the one who carries this covenant, because he's the one who is circumcised and given the sign at the time when God prescribed, because Ishmael obviously was already too old.
And he carries the promise of the blessing.
Correct. Which we're going to get into a little bit more in a minute. So that is the covenant. There we go. Yes?
Okay, so, this one had dawned on me just this time. I hadn't really thought about it before. The fact that from Abraham, the promised seed did not come until after the circumcision, until after the sign, that sign of the covenant. So I found that interesting, because it's like he's been talking about this covenant. Now here's the sign of the covenant, and then once that sign of the covenant was done, then Sarah conceives and the child comes forth.
Right.
So I found it was interesting that it didn't happen before the sign of the covenant. It happened after.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that is really interesting. And what's interesting about that too is that God kind of waited so long to give the sign of the covenant, because he didn't give that as part of the initial cutting of the covenant.
Yeah.
Ishmael was already 13.
Ishmael's 13 years old. So in some sense you can kind of understand, God said all of these things. I don't think Abraham is trying to force the fulfillment of the covenant. I think he's just going off of what he knows and what he understands. But there is this, it does kind of re-emphasize this aspect that there is this process, and I don't want to say delay, but there is this, it takes time for the covenant to be, for the fulfillment of the covenant to come to pass.
God's clock ticks differently.
It does. Very differently.
Along with that, is there a reason that Abraham's name is changed right here versus like when he cut the covenant?
Right.
Is his name changed when the sign comes? Is that the typical way God? I know he changes names.
He does.
So I'm just wondering why it was right here.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know that I know the answer. I think the way that God states the covenant here is slightly different. And again, I don't know why it's different here than I don't know why he didn't say it this way from the outset. But, because before it was like, you're going to be the father of a great nation, and now you're going to be the father of many nations, which is why his name is changed, because it has that different meaning.
Yeah.
Well, wouldn't Ishmael and that choice that was made by Sarah to give Hagar to Abraham, doesn't that have a part to play in that difference? In the delay. Because God does promise Ishmael that he will be a great nation.
Right.
So
yeah, I think at this point, we do know that, but I don't know that.
But then it would be 2 nations, and this is many nations. I don't think. I'm just gonna I'm verbally processing that. I don't think God changes his plan because of our mistaken believing.
Right.
And
my sense on this one is that, kind of like we saw, the Noahic covenant was a reestablishment of the Adamic covenant, or the creation covenant. You see that God cuts the covenant in Genesis 15, But here it says, I establish my, so there's something that is actually being established where Abraham enters into that covenant with a blood, because it's a blood covenant, right? Even the carcass is being split in half. It's one of those kingship blood covenants. So Abraham actually has to enter into it through this circumcision, and that happens here. And so that's why I think the Lord, even the phrasing, like Emma was saying, it changes, right? Like I will make you into exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations. And kings will come forth from you, and I will establish my covenant. So there's that word where that establishment sort of happens when Abraham is 99, and he enters into that covenant with circumcision as well. So I think the cutting of a covenant, and when you look at the Hebrew, the karat, and the word that is used for established, they're two different words pertaining to the same event. So that could be one of the other reasons.
And they don't always happen.
At the same time.
Right.
Yeah.
Is that what you were saying earlier about like renewing?
Yeah.
2 words for covenant, renewing. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. I want to get to the rest of this real quick before we run out of time. Okay. So, kind of going along with what we've been talking about of like that this is the everlasting covenant and that God kind of builds kind of covenantally, I want to, and this is what I thought was really helpful and I really liked from this class, is that the connection that is made to these other covenants going forward. Because I think it continues to bring a little bit of sometimes some clarification and different things like that. So, particularly with the seed, because that is ultimately kind of the biggest question and the biggest wrestle of who is the Messiah, who is the one who fulfills all the prophecies and all of the covenants. And so I think this progressive revelation of the seed is particularly important, but the other pieces are not forgotten. So, okay, so the first section is the land, and really this should say Deuteronomy 29 and 30. And you could argue with me that this land covenant is not a covenant in and of itself, and I'd probably say, yeah, you're probably right. It's not really a new covenant, it's more of it's another confirmation of covenant about the land. And even the titling in the TLV is renewing the covenant, and so it's not that it's so brand new, but what this does, what Deuteronomy 29 and 30, and we're not going to go into a lot of detail on any of these because I want you to see the framework more so than the details. But with what's happening in Deuteronomy 29 and 30 is that all the people are kind of come before the Lord again, and God is promising the land, but he's also, this is the part where we have this distinction kind of between ownership of the land and actually like enjoying or occupying the land, because there is a discussion in here about when they are, about the blessings and curses, about when they're not faithful to Adonai, that they are cast out of the land, but God promises to bring them back. And even when they're not actually physically in the land is still theirs. And so this is really kind of bringing clarification that it is, kind of this, it is this everlasting covenant, like just as God said back in Genesis 17. But at this point, because the Mosaic Covenant has come in, and the Mosaic Covenant does have, is a bit more of that traditional type of covenant where I will give you protection. There is a conditional nature to some. I'm not saying that it's entirely conditional. We're not going to dig into the depths of the Mosaic Covenant right now, but there are elements that are conditional. There are many, many statements. It's not difficult to see it that God says, you must do this, and then I will do this. So it's that more traditional type of covenant where both parties have responsibility. And so that's a lot of what's happening is he's telling them then, okay, so I've told you what you have to do to stay in the land. when you're disobedient and I kick you out, I promise I'm going to bring you back because I've made this everlasting covenant with Abraham. So that's where it's helpful to understand this Abrahamic covenant as so foundational and unbreakable, because the fact that the land belongs to them and that they have the right to it does not change. However, God has by this point given additional kind of requirements, and if they're disobedient to some of those, they may just have to put it very loosely and very, casually, they might have to go in timeout for a while. But he promises to bring them back. It doesn't break the covenant. It doesn't break their right to it. It doesn't say that, all right, you messed up. I'm done with you. I'm going to try someone else. That's not what's happening when Israel is forced out of the land.
Could it be said that even if Israel is not in possession of the land, because God initiated the covenant with Abraham, it is still their land, even if they're not in possession of it?
Exactly. Yes, that is what, and I think even, find the exact verse, but that's basically what God is explaining to them in Deuteronomy 29 and 30 of like, I am going to bring you back. It is still yours. You just may not, and even we have this kind of, we're gonna talk about the new covenant in Jeremiah 31 in a little bit, but even in Deuteronomy 30 verse 6, he talks about circumcising the heart and the heart of your descendants. So there's kind of reaffirmation of this everlasting covenant. It's just laying out the framework of this, of whether they're actually kind of enjoying the land. It's kind of this occupancy or this ownership versus occupancy or enjoyment of the land that is kind of being further clarified at this point.
Good.
Okay, so then if we move on to this seed portion, we look at 2 Samuel 7. This is the Davidic covenant, which of course we know that ultimately it said the Messiah must come from the line of David. And so this is kind of the further, again, clarification of where is this seed coming from? How do we know when this is really the one, the Messiah, the one we're waiting for, the one that's going to fulfill even back to that Genesis 3 reality. So 2 Samuel 7 is talking about, initially kind of talking about this building the house for God, but kind of around verse 11, yes, we get to this kind of covenant about the seed here. The second part of verse 11. So moreover, Adonai declares to you that Adonai will make a house for you. When your days are done and you sleep with your fathers, I will raise up your seed, who will come forth from after you, and I will establish his kingdom. He will build a house for my name, and I will establish his royal throne forever. I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. If he commits iniquity, I will correct him with the rod of men and the strokes from the sons of men. Yet my loving kindness will not be withdrawn from him, as I withdrew it from Saul, whom I removed from before you. So your house and your kingship will be secure forever before you. Your throne will be established forever. So we kind of have this, there's a lot of forever in here. Your throne is forever, your kingdom is forever, your seed forever. Even after you die, I'm going to raise up your seed. So this is the from the line of David is going to come this great king. And I think I know Melchizedek is not mentioned here, but I'm just thinking about even the conversation we had about Melchizedek, about this king and priest, which I kind of briefly mentioned earlier. David is another one who's kind of referred to as fulfilling both of those roles to some extent. He does some priestly things. He's not really a priest, but he does some priestly things. But this is kind of the solidification of like, I'm going to do all of this through your seed. The everlasting kingdom is going to come through your seed. And so it's continuing on. Again, if we have that foundational basis of the Abrahamic covenant that we're building on, we can see, okay, this is, I think there's a somewhat universal implication to this aspect of the great nation, multitude of nations covenant with Abraham, but we're also still, as we know, as we're, if we were to trace kind of a slightly different thread through the scripture, we're also still looking for that Messiah. And so at this point, we're having clarification about that Messiah, the ultimate king who's going to come, and his reign is going to be forever, which does not nullify the universal type of implication about being part of God's family through Abraham. So again, if we have that foundational understanding, then we see this clarification or this additional information building on top of that and not nullifying it. I think we start to see kind of God's trajectory a little bit. Okay, last one. We're almost there.
Can one say that even in the genealogy of David's line, it goes back to the foundation of the Abrahamic Covenant?
Exactly.
And because of that reality, the Abrahamic Covenant being everlasting, God can and does promise King David that his will also be everlasting.
Right, exactly. I think that's, I agree. Okay. So then the last covenant we're going to look at this connection is the new covenant, Jeremiah 31, which kind of is perpetuating on this blessing sense, in the sense that, but it's also the kind of the more universal version of this seed reality. So it's kind of both and. It doesn't, we're not trying to put walls between these things. It's okay if there's some crossover, but the goal is to show that all of these pieces of this covenant are being perpetuated. So Jeremiah 31 verse 30, behold, the days are coming, it is a declaration of Adonai, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not like the covenant I made with their fathers in the day I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. For they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them. It is a declaration of Adonai. But this is a covenant I will make with the house of Israel after those days. It is a declaration of Adonai. I will put my Torah within them. Yes, I will write it on their heart. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will each teach his neighbor or each his brother, saying, know Adonai, for they will all know me. From the least of them to the greatest, it is a declaration of Adonai, for I will forgive their iniquity, and their sin I will remember no more. And of course he goes on, but the significance of this is, at this point, the Torah is then written on their hearts, and all have the ability to know God more intimately at that point, which is, of course, this much greater blessing at this point. So, and really the significance of the Torah being written on our hearts is it gives us a greater ability to keep the covenant, to be faithful, to be obedient. And that, again, it always comes back to relationship, and so it all comes back to the ability to have a greater kind of relationship with God. So, and of course, I didn't go, we could extend this on and we could look at, and Johannes was doing a great job of bringing up a lot of the New Testament passages, but of course there's a million places we could go that would reemphasize these principles there as well. But I just wanted you to even just see it within the Tanakh itself. Like, we don't even have to wait for Yeshua to be here before it's promised. I'm gonna take this one step further, and you're going to be, again, built on this foundation of this everlasting covenant with Abraham. It's like I'm gonna empower you to be obedient unto relationship by writing the Torah on your very heart.
It's interesting to me that in verse 34 there, and in the following, the 34 through 36, the Lord even refers back to the created order. The light by day, the fixed order, the moon by night, and the stars. And so it even refers back to the Adamic covenant. Exactly,
because it's the ultimate goal of
all the covenants. It's the ultimate goal for us to love
of this, because they're all part of this restored order. It's all part of this. Like we talked about, like they had order in the garden, and then we went back into chaos with with sin and the fall, and all of this is unto all of these covenants and all of history. The coming of Yeshua, the first coming of Yeshua, the ultimate second coming of Yeshua, the new creations, new heavens, new earth, New Jerusalem is all unto restored order and perfect relationship with God.
It says in verse 35, only if this fixed order departs from before me,
yes,
then also might Israel's offspring cease from being a nation.
Right.
Before me.
Right, which is even just this re-emphasis of this everlasting covenant. It's like God can't go back on his word.
Because he can't deny his own himself.
Right. And so, so I think hopefully this is a little bit helpful of just to seeing this, how foundational this covenant is and how the others interact with it a little bit. Because I know sometimes it's difficult to like see how all these things work together. And again, I know we didn't dive into the Mosaic Covenant so much today, but I just wanted you to see how God is using this covenant and how, I mean, it's like ironclad. Like nothing gets through this. And just to see the other, because I think sometimes we see the covenants building, and that means the one before it gets canceled out. And I'm just hoping that this is helpful, even in just reinforcing the idea that they're actually all perpetuating the same thing, even all the way back to the Adamic covenant of we're just trying to get back to order. We're trying to restore order and relationship with God.
The order that God created.
Right, exactly. Which is ultimately best for us, right? If we can live within God's order, it's going to go well for us. So.
If you use the replacement thing, it just goes into replacement theology.
Right.
So.
Right. And so, and that's just, it's just like, it just breaks my heart, like, to go the replacement way of just like, because it's like, look at how amazing this is. Like, look at, even just for what we've seen, I know we like continued on, but even if you're just to look at these first 4 portions of Genesis that we've covered so far since restarting kind of the Torah reading, it's like, there's so much faithfulness and there's so much like patience and kindness from the Lord so far. Then to see that we do know the whole story and we see how that continues on, I think that foundation of faithfulness and righteousness is so much more encouraging to me than understanding that, there's a God who's going to start something new or replace or just kind of cancel out all that history. And I'm like, no, like,
well, like God went, oops.
Right.
We need to do something to,
Right.
That just makes, in a way, doubt.
Right.
Whether he really had a grand plan.
Exactly.
With that replacement.
Right.
And I think the fact, like, if you're reading the book of Jeremiah, which is really intense, and here in the midst of the height of these people's rebellion and the height of these people's sin, the Lord is still telling them, I have a covenant with you. I'm making a new covenant with you.
Remember my order.
In the midst of all that, it was like in the midst of really chaos, every time these were setting things straight after extremes, and right now these people are in an extreme, and God is showing his love to the extent of, I'm going to write this on your heart. And so to me, where this lands in the story of them is always kind of a little over, it really hits my heart that he's doing it at this time.
Because I think at that point it seems it's hopeless. It's like we're never going to be back in our land. We're never going to be a unified people. The kingdom. That's why it says, even the house of Israel and the house of Judah, because they have the split kingdom at that point. So they don't, they're kind of losing hope for this. And God's like, no, this everlasting covenant is still here, and to make you believe it, I'm going to write it on your heart. I'm going to promise you that it's going to be written on your heart, so that you can be mine forever. So it's pretty incredible. Like, I mean, I just like, that's why I always say, like, this is what I love about the Bible is that you can study. I can study the Bible my whole life and I'm still not going to know everything. And like, I'm still going to be like, what? You really did that? So great. Anyway, okay.
Even if you're losing hope, God does not change.
Right. Which is,
I think that's what I get out of it. That's
exactly
why I love that chapter so much.
Right. And that's even going back to the overarching story and the replacement theology thing is like, that was one of the big things for me is like understanding like God never breaks his covenant with Israel and the Jewish people. It's like, that means that he's also not going to give up on me. Like, that also means, like, I can trust him. Like, if he's that faithful, I can trust his faithfulness to me too. Which is significant. Anyway, okay, it's time to go to service, so I'm going to pray and we will be done. So Lord, I just thank you so much for your word. I thank you for just the joy that we can have in studying and understanding and just even just gaining these little nuggets of understanding and seeing how you've woven your presence through history and how much hope that can give us of that you'll continue to be faithful, Lord. Lord, I just ask that you would just continue to give us revelation of your faithfulness and your kindness and your patience with us, Lord, and that would just become very real to each of us, Lord. I just ask that your presence would continue to be with us as we go into service, Lord. I thank you for the Shabbat. I thank you for this day of rest and this day of getting to look toward and hope for the reality when heaven and earth are come back together once again, Lord. I just ask that you would just continue to encourage our hearts and just let us enjoy the blessing of your presence and your Shabbat, Lord. B'Shem Yeshua. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.